everyone, I'm Anthropomantic Fiend and I do horror-related things on the internet, and today I am doing a review of the movie Vampyres, and that is Vampires with a Y, in case you didn't see the title. And this is a movie that was not requested by anyone at all, but I was told around the end of August before I came here to college by a good friend of mine that the movie, which I'd been meaning to watch for a while, was on Tubi, and it was very much in the vein of 70s vampire exploitation that I tend to watch and kind of obsess over but also have mixed feelings about, so I just decided to review this because I wanted to. I do have more reviews lined up that are going to be things that have been asked for by other people, but this is my channel. I'm doing what makes me happy. Vampyres is a movie that came out in 1974. It is directed by Jose Ramon Larraz, who also directed the slasher film Edge of the Axe, Deadly Manor, and Rest in Pieces. And the film stars Anulka Zubinska. I do not know if I pronounced that right. The poster art that's used on Tubi just credits her as Anulka, so clearly they were struggling as well. But she was also in Listomania, Bare Essence, The Likely Lads, or the Lively Lads. I can't read my own handwriting again. And she also, at one point in her career, won Playboy Playmate of the Month. This film also stars Murray Brown, who was in Dan Curtis's adaptation of Dracula, The Deadly Affair, and Hardcore. Marianne Morris, who was in the film Corruption with Peter Cushing, Queen Kong and Percy's Progress, and Brian Deacon, who is in the 1979 film simply called Jesus, playing Jesus, as well as The Triple Echo and The Beyond, not the Lucio Fulci movie, some other movie that came out in 2017. And this film follows two lesbian vampires. They're really more bisexual, but they very much follow the same archetype that the 10 million, Carmilla adaptations I've watched do, who starts the story as living people and upon being discovered being their queer selves are promptly shot and killed. That is not a spoiler. This is the cold open of the movie before the opening credits even start. Following that, I don't know how or why, but the two of them become vampires and start luring men into their castle by hitchhiking and asking them to drive them to their house, which is just a little bit down the way. And their house, I guess, is technically a manor, but it feels like a castle to me. I'll get into that. And then proceeding to make love with them and then drain their blood and put their lifeless corpses back in the car for the police to find. And during all of this, there is a young couple living in a camper just a little ways away from the house. The boyfriend is kind of oblivious to all the goings on there, or he's seeing things happening, but he's not seeing anything strange about them, and the girl is like, what the hell is going on in there? Meanwhile, there's also one man who one of the two vampires, Fran, their names are Fran and Maria, has been keeping basically as a prisoner and gradually just draining his life essence away. So the score for this film was done by James Clark, who also did the scores for Hardcore, Let's Get Laid. If that doesn't tell you what the background of a lot of the people who worked on this film was, I don't know what will. Even though I technically actually know nothing about that film, I'm making assumptions here, but I feel fairly confident in my assumptions. And also scored The Wildcats of St. Trinian's. His score is very much one of the high points of the film for me. Throughout most of the film, it's very traditionally spooky, lots of keys, some organ in the background, a lot of piano sounds, and just the occasional hints of electric guitar, but the main theme that we hear during the opening credits and the end credits is full-out fun 70s rock. I mean, not all out. It's still very spooky. It uses a lot of weird, non-traditional progressions that are more reminiscent of a horror score, but you've got drums, you've got electric guitar, and you've got keys, and it's all very spooky but also very rockin', and I love it. This movie tells you exactly what it is from the very beginning in a way that both frustrates me, but I also have a lot of respect for, because the very first shot of the film, pretty much, that's not true, there's like an establishing shot of the spooky mansion first, but like immediately afterwards we're just looking at two women, full frontal nudity, in bed with each other, and you're like, oh, yep, this is what this kind of movie does. Oh boy. It does just immediately set up the queerness of the characters and the whole lesbian vampire archetype thing. It also immediately sets up the levels of exploitative nudity that are throughout this film, which I'm less jazzed about, and then proceeds to immediately kill them. They're just dead before the credits even start, and in that way I kind of love that, because instead of doing the thing that happens at the end of so many of these movies, I've talked about this with The Vampire Lovers and numerous other movies like this, pretty much all of them are adaptations of Carmilla, this one isn't. Take the lesbian vampire archetype and use it to demonize queer people, but at the same time really make it very appealing and romantic seeming within the context of the film, and then proceeds to heroically kill those characters at the end of the movie. Even a film like The Blood-Spattered Bride, that is clearly not on the side of the piece of shit male lead character, does that at the end of the movie, and it's really depressing. Minor spoilers for The Blood-Spattered Bride, which I'm going to be referencing a lot in this review. But in this movie, it happens at the beginning of the film and is the setup for the two characters becoming vampires and doing the thing throughout the movie. So it's a kind of bury your gays moment, but they don't stay buried, and I love that. This very explicit, too frank, too lingering on and pleasant kind of vibe that you get from a lot of 70s exploitation film is juxtaposed with these very polite, refined scenes, very elegant looking settings, and a lot of refined but kind of bland suits worn throughout the film, and just these scenes of polite exchange between characters just juxtaposed against pure exploitation, and I found that intriguing. I kind of saw what they were going for with, carnal desires being the undercurrent of whatever being repressed by I can't words anymore. This isn't a sentence, but hopefully you understand what I'm trying to say, but I just don't like the exploitative part of it, if you couldn't tell. What I do really like about this film, though, is the unique way the vampires lure people in. I don't think I've really seen the hitchhiking vampires thing done before. There are obviously vampires that pretend to be in distress and lure people back into their lairs and sedate them with wine and then feed on their blood. And there are also a lot of hitchhiking horror stories, so many, both from the perspective of the hitchhikers themselves and from the people picking up the hitchhikers. But I've never seen the two combined in this way, and I thought it was an interesting angle. And I also thought it was cool kind of having this little camper as one of the settings in the film, as well as seeing this basement, this wine cellar underneath the, I'm just going to call it a manor. I guess that's what it is. Seeing the cellar underneath the manor where the vampires actually sleep. Usually it's some kind of a tomb or a crypt, but they sleep in the wine cellar in this film, and I thought that was an interesting, unique take. And going back to the nudity thing, it kind of started out feeling like what the Hammer movies do, specifically the Karnstein trilogy, where it's super frank nudity, but it serves a purpose within the story, despite still being horribly exploitative. And to some extent, that's kind of true. The sex scenes within the story serve to show the way that Fran and Maria are gradually draining away, namely this one person who Fran is keeping prisoner's life and his essence, both by draining his blood and kind of just wearing him out sexually and drugging him and just doing things that are just gradually draining away all of his willpower. But those scenes are really uncomfortable. They don't feel natural in any way, not that I would know what that even looks like, but they feel awkward. They go go on for way too long, and then we just keep getting more of them, and it's like, I understand, I don't need more of this. And then there are just other scenes in the film that don't serve any purpose at all, like that. There is another scene where just Fran and Maria are, again, completely naked and just kind of randomly groping each other in the shower, and at least it's not more uncomfortable heterosexual sex, and at least they're actually kind of having a conversation about their nefarious plans while it's happening, so there's plot, but it's very uncomfortable, and it feels like they're just doing these weird postures on top of each other. Again, I don't know what that would even look like naturally, but nothing about it feels natural, so a lot of me being uncomfortable throughout this film, and not for good reasons. And then there's like 2 seconds where the girl who's living in the camper is like, you know what, I'm going to have sex with my boyfriend now, and we see her take off her top, and it's just there and doesn't need to be for any reason whatsoever. So it's one of those movies again. It's not as bad in my eyes as Lust for a Vampire, even though in some ways Lust for a Vampire didn't linger as much as this film does. I might have even been just a little bit more comfortable with Lust for a Vampire, but that movie just pissed me off in terms of what it did with the Carmilla mythos, and this movie doesn't have that problem, but I was still very uncomfortable. I also found the way the vampires work within this movie to be somewhat interesting, because for one thing, they both get shot at the beginning of the movie. Next time we see them, they're both kind of just lurking on the sides of roads in these big flowy capes and bringing people into their manor, and we never get a real backstory about who they were in life, why they became vampires after they die, why, if they're living here, they happen to have wine from the Carpathian Mountains, if they have fangs, because there's one scene where they bite somebody, and in other scenes they're like stabbing them and making cuts in their arms, and it really is very loose with how the vampires actually work in this, but they're people who were once dead that are now alive again and are drinking blood. So, vampires. And really, as I will talk about when I get to characters, Fran and Maria are the most interesting characters in the film. I really didn't give a shit about any of the living, mortal, human characters, with the exception of maybe the girl in the camper. But I also like being able to fill in some of the blanks with my imagination here, because pretty much the vibe that I got was some guy, who knows, we never even see who it is, it's just a hand with a gun, doesn't like the fact that they're who they are and shoots them, and because of that act, they are able to return from the dead and wreak vengeance against mankind, and by mankind I do mean specifically men. So kind of the Crow thing, except as far as I can tell, none of the people who they're killing actually had anything to do with their death. Again, we never even know who did that, but I like that overall concept, which is how I'm seeing it. I have no idea what the intent was, but I like my interpretation. And they are not able to turn into bats, but there is a lot of great bat imagery in the film. I should talk about that in visuals. Where am I? And overall, just pacing-wise, this film is very, very slow, which I do not like when it's long, drawn-out, uncomfortable sex scenes, but otherwise, there's still not a ton going on within the film, but it's aesthetically pleasing enough that it lends to this kind of creeping atmosphere that I liked. And then when it does get actually violent and intense, the kills that are in the film are very, very bloody and very, very messy and somewhat cathartic. They're not particularly gory or like creative kills or anything. They're just very bloody, and if you cover the screen in red blood, especially overly garish red blood, I will be happy. So all in all, the film's kind of slow, but I like it when it's not being porn. Visually speaking, there's a lot of really gorgeous bat imagery within the film, and by a lot, I mean there's some shots in the opening credits and then the bats come back because they live in the cellar with the vampires. I just like that, and it was a nice tie-in to kind of more traditional Hollywood vampire tropes in a fun way. And we also get that kind of fun tie to classic vampires within the look of the vampires, because the overall look of the film, both in terms of sets and costumes, is very, very naturalistic, but the vampires themselves have these billowing cloaks and all these flowy outfits, and they're not always just wearing the same black gown or whatever. They have a lot of varied outfits, and all of them were very gothic and much appreciated. And even then, it's naturalistic, but in a very atmospheric way. We spend a lot of time outside on the side of the road near this manor, which has this cemetery, but also these woods, and everything feels like it's kind of on this cloudy fall day with crunching leaves underneath everyone's feet and maybe a little fog here and there. It's a beautiful, beautiful looking film, and I would probably recommend watching it in October because it really does feel like a beautiful, spooky fall day. The manor, castle, whatever it is itself looks wonderful from the outside and from the inside, and it has this great mixture of really desolate places with cobwebs within them, and then kind of their main guest room thingy where they will drink wine with people, and that is kind of much more full of life and full of much more different influences within the decoration, because a lot of it just feels like your classic European Gothic manor, but their little guest room is full of more exotic influences, little pieces of art that were reminiscent of different Eastern cultures or what have you. I didn't pay particularly close attention to it, but it was not all just traditionally European, and I kind of liked that. Also, backpedaling a little bit to plot, I forgot to mention the one other scene that I did really like because it was a fun change of pace is the scene where another person has picked up them as hitchhikers, even though they were really picking him up, and he winds up in the manor, and they've got this Carpathian wine that they give to people to basically drug them and then drink their blood. And the guy that they pick up just so happens to be, there go my notes, a wine taster. So he plays this little guessing game with them, and he's drinking the wine, trying to figure out what it is, and he's trying to apply all of his best wine tasting skills to it. And it's a really fun little scene that I was not expecting out of this kind of movie, but was quite appreciated. And that's also the scene where we find out that this isn't something they've gotten from any kind of traditional source of wine. It's this obscure stuff that apparently comes from the Carpathian Mountains, which is another fun tie-in to classic Hollywood Gothic vampires, except that they actually do drink wine, but it's all vintage red wine, and it's all brewed in the Carpathian Mountains. And it does actually feel like that scene from the 1931 Dracula where Bela Lugosi as the Count drugs Dwight Frye as Renfield and proceeds to feed on him, except Fran and Maria actually do also drink the wine themselves. Character-wise, I really like both Fran and Maria. They have a fun dynamic where they're both these classic predatory female vampires, but Fran is much more the very obviously kind of dominating femme fatale character, and she has this great line in the film where she's just like, that's the way I have to be accepted with no questions and no explanations. And she really just, while still being very polite to her victims before she kills them, just doesn't give them any leeway to get what they want out of her, and just is like, yep, this is who I am, deal with it, I'm gonna drink your blood now. Have I been calling her Maria? Her name is Miriam. If I've been calling her Maria, I don't remember, I'm so sorry. Her name is Miriam, but Miriam feels a little bit less forceful. It feels a little bit more like she's kind of pretending to be very soft and delicate and drawing people in, and then viciously killing them. So that was fun. They really don't have any personality traits outside of that. There's this kind of sense that they have a history together, and I empathize with their characters more than anybody else in the film, but there's really not a lot to the characters to begin with. I kind of liked the way that the girl in the camper with her boyfriend is set up, because it does remind me a lot, again, of the blood-spattered bride. I think that character's name is Susan, and she's the one who can see the strange vampiric stuff going on around her and is kind of sticking her nose into it. Meanwhile, her boyfriend is like, you're just delusional, except there's more of a socio-political subtext that in the blood-spattered bride that's not here at all, and this character never really gets drawn into the world of the vampires the way Susan does. She's always kind of at odds with it. The vampires themselves seem to have some kind of connection to her, though, that I never really understood, because when she really comes face to face with them, Fran walks up to her and is just like, I always knew we'd find each other, and is like, there's this mark on your forehead that I would know you by. She touches the girl's forehead, and the girl touches her forehead later in another scene, and I saw absolutely no mark there, so I have no idea what that was about. And then later in the movie, towards the climax, minor spoilers, but they kind of attack her and torture her in this very exploitative scene that didn't make much sense at all to me and just didn't need to be in the film. I don't know what that was about. The ending to this film is iffy. But on the plus side, she's also a painter, much like Susan in The Blood-Spattered Bride is a sketch artist, so I liked the little bit of that, even though that doesn't really play a part in the narrative the way it does in The Blood-Spattered Bride either, but she seemed to be a good painter. Her painting was pretty. And then the guy who they're keeping there, who's kind of gradually losing all his will and all of his independence, didn't like the uncomfortable sex scenes with him. I feel like that's already been established. However, I love the way we see him go from this sure of himself, confident character who's arrogant and kind of trying to push at Fran to get stuff out of her, to the point where he cannot, in fact, get out of bed and is just screaming from the upstairs room for Fran because he literally cannot do anything without her. I love that his watch stops at one point, which kind of symbolizes the lack of control over his life. That's another story point that I meant to bring up, actually. All of the male victims, their watches, for like no logical reason at all, it's kind of a supernatural thing, all of their watches will stop before the vampires feed on them, and it's this great little symbol of both their time literally being up and this lack of control. The only thing that really even happens in this film effects-wise is some nice 70s red blood, which there is at first just a little bit of and then a whole lot of. Again, I just always love it when the screen is covered in blood, so that's another big thing in the plus column. So overall, my feelings on this film are very, very mixed. Ultimately, I would say I probably liked it. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, but I like the way this film ended a whole lot more than most other movies in the kind of lesbian vampire exploitation thing that was going on in the 70s. It's a little bit jokey at one point, but I just like where they leave the vampire characters a lot more. I don't even need to say anything else about the exploitative nudity and sex scenes. You already know how I feel about that stuff. But the film itself is shot beautifully. The overall aesthetic of everything is gorgeous, and all of the acting is pretty good. Some of the dialogue is a little bit stilted, but most of the actors still manage to sell it. So ultimately, I would say this is a pretty solid movie. It's a bit too exploitative to really become an absolute favorite of mine, but if I come across this on physical media, I probably will buy it because I do think it belongs within my collection of vampire movies. And if anything I've talked about today sounds up your alley, this is currently free to watch on Tubi, so you can check it out there. And I think I heard that Blue Underground might have put out a nice release of this. I might be wrong about that, but I know there is a release of this out there on physical media to be had as well. That is my review of Vampyres. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye.